How does a person vanish without a trace? No footprints, no records, no past, just gone. But what if they reappeared, not as the person you once knew, but as the mastermind behind your worst nightmare? Imagine driving alone on a desolate highway at night, the road stretching into the darkness. Now imagine slamming your brakes as a small, bloodied child stumbles out of the woods, her body weak, her breath barely there. Who is she? Where did she come from? And why is her name Hannah Wells? Not in any database, as if she never existed. What starts as a rescue mission turns into a race against time. Ethan Grayson, a man haunted by his past, unwittingly pulls a thread that unravels a horrifying conspiracy. One that leads to a hidden facility called the Cold Room, where children are taken and never seen again. But the real shock? This girl knows his sister's name, Emily, who vanished years ago. And if what she says is true, Emily never died. She became part of the system. How far would you go to uncover the truth? And when you find it, will you wish you hadn't? The highway stretched endlessly before him, swallowed by the night. Ethan Grayson tightened his grip on the wheel, his calloused fingers flexing over the leather. The snow had started an hour ago, thin flakes swirling in his headlights, dissolving against the damp pavement. It was the kind of night truckers hated. Icy roads, low visibility, and nothing but the hum of the engine for company. He was used to the solitude. It was the silence that unnerved him. Then, something moved. A small figure stumbled out of the tree lean, barely visible through the frost-covered windshield. Ethan's stomach clenched. A deer? No, too small. Instinct took over. He slammed the brakes. The truck skidded, the tires screeching against the frozen asphalt. For a split second, he thought he wouldn't stop in time. The figure wavered, took another step forward, and then crumpled onto the road. Jesus Christ, Ethan muttered, yanking the truck into park. His heart pounded as he threw open the door and jumped out, boots crunching against ice. It wasn't an animal. It was a child. A little girl, no older than 9, curled up on the cold ground. Blood stained the front of her sweatshirt, seeping through the fabric in dark, wet streaks. Her hair was tangled, dirt clinging to her skin. Ethan's breath fogged as he crouched beside her. "Hey, kid. Hey, can you hear me?" His voice came out rougher than intended. The girl's eyelids fluttered. A faint whimper slipped from her lips. Ethan's gut twisted. She wasn't just lost. Someone had hurt her. Badly. The girl barely weighed anything as Ethan lifted her into his arms. She was freezing. He could feel it through his jacket, her body small and frail against his chest. "You're gonna be all right, sweetheart," he murmured, more to himself than to her. But he wasn't sure that was true. He climbed into the cab, cranking the heat as high as it would go. The girl trembled, her breaths shallow. He reached for his phone with one hand, dialing 911. 911, "What's your emergency?" a dispatcher answered. "I found a kid on Highway 17, Ethan said, pressing the truck into drive. "She's hurt bad. Looks like she lost a lot of blood." "Sir, is she responsive?" "Not really," he muttered, glancing at her. "She's barely hanging on. The nearest hospital is St. Vincent's Memorial, about 30 miles east. Can you get her there?" "I'm already on my way," Ethan said, pressing harder on the gas. The dispatcher continued talking, but Ethan's focus was on the girl. Her small hands clutched at her stomach, blood seeping between her fingers. Something was wrong. Deeply, horrifically wrong. By the time Ethan pulled up to St. Vincent's ER entrance, the girl was barely conscious. The automatic doors hissed open as he carried her inside. "I need help," he called out. The hospital staff reacted immediately. A nurse in scrubs rushed forward, pulling a gurney alongside him. "What happened?" she demanded as they laid the girl down. "I don't know," Ethan said, stepping back. "She was on the side of the road like this." Dr. Tessa Monroe entered, her sharp brown eyes scanning the child with practiced efficiency. "She's hypothermic," she muttered, checking her vitals. And she lifted the girl's sweatshirt and froze. Ethan saw it too. A bandage wrapped tightly around her abdomen, soaked through with fresh blood. Surgical scars beneath it, deep, raw, hastily stitched. "What the hell?" he whispered. Tessa snapped into action. We need imaging and fluids. Now. As nurses wheeled the girl away, Sheriff Colton Hayes entered the ER, his broad frame filling the doorway. He had the kind of presence that made people straighten up. His hazel eyes locked onto Ethan. You the one who brought her in? Yeah, Ethan said, still shaken. You find her like this? That's what I said. Colton didn't look convinced. We'll need a statement. Found a little girl bleeding out on the highway. Kinda convenient. Ethan bristled. You think I had something to do with this? Not saying that, Colton replied. Just saying we ask questions. Before Ethan could respond, Tessa stormed back in, her face pale. Her records, she said. They're gone. Colton frowned. What do you mean gone? Tessa's voice dropped. I tried pulling up her medical history. Her ID. It's like she doesn't exist. The room was silent. Ethan stared at Tessa. How does a child not exist? Tessa shook her head. I don't know, but this is deliberate. Someone wiped her records. The moment I tried running a search, the system lagged. Then, gone. Colton crossed his arms. You saying someone's covering their tracks? That's exactly what I'm saying. Ethan exhaled. Jesus. Tessa hesitated, then said, That bandage on her stomach? That's not from an accident. Someone took something from her. Ethan's stomach turned. Colton's jaw tightened. What do you mean? I mean she has surgical scars. Fresh. And they're not clean. Ethan swallowed hard. What the hell is going on? Before anyone could respond, the hospital alarms blared. The security desk crackled to life. Code black. Lockdown in progress. Unauthorized personnel on site. Colton reached for his gun. We've got company. Ethan saw them before Colton did. 3 men in tactical gear moving through the hallway, cutting through the chaos of the ER like sharks in bloodied water. They weren't panicked. They were hunting. For her. Move, Colton barked. Tessa didn't hesitate. She rushed to the girl's bedside, unhooking the 4 with practiced speed. They're coming for her, she whispered. Then we don't let them take her, Ethan said. Colton grabbed Ethan's arm. You armed? Ethan shook his head. Colton scowled. Then stay close. The hallway lights flickered. The hospital's security was failing. Tessa lifted the girl into her arms, her small frame barely stirring. She's too weak to run. Ethan took a breath. Then I'll carry her. Colton checked the hallway. Back exit. Now. They moved fast. The girl in Ethan's arms, her small body barely holding on. The pounding of boots echoed behind them. They were being followed. Ethan pushed forward, the weight of the girl against him, the hospital walls closing in, and as they burst through the emergency exit into the freezing night, the chase began. The truck rattled over uneven dirt roads, its headlights barely cutting through the dense forest. The old hunting cabin appeared out of the darkness, its weathered structure standing like a ghost among the trees. Ethan pulled the truck to a stop and killed the engine. The night was eerily silent, save for the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. Colton stepped out first, scanning the area with a practiced eye. No signs of movement. No tire tracks. Looks like no one's been here in years. Ethan climbed out, opening the passenger door and carefully lifting Hannah into his arms. She stirred slightly, a soft whimper escaping her lips. She was still weak. Tessa followed behind them, her doctor's bag slung over her shoulder. Let's get her inside. The cabin was cold and smelled of dust and aged wood. Ethan laid Hannah on the worn-out couch near the fireplace, while Colton locked the door and checked the windows. We can't stay here long, Colton muttered, setting his gun on the wooden table. Whoever's after her will be looking. Tessa kneeled beside Hannah, feeling for a pulse. She needs warmth. Ethan, there's a blanket over there. Ethan grabbed the scratchy wool blanket and draped it over Hannah. Her small fingers clutched at it instinctively, but her breathing remained shallow. After a few moments, her eyes fluttered open. She looked around, confused, then locked eyes with Ethan. A flicker of recognition passed through her gaze. Then she whispered something that made Ethan's blood run cold. Emily. Ethan's breath hitched. He stared at Hannah, his mind racing. What did you say? He asked, his voice low. Hannah blinked slowly, as if struggling to stay conscious. They took Emily to the cold room. Ethan exchanged a look with Colton, whose expression hardened. Tessa looked just as stunned. "Who's Emily?" Tessa asked. Ethan hesitated, his jaw tightening. "My sister," he finally admitted. "She went missing 20 years ago." Tessa frowned. "How does Hannah know about her?" "I don't know," Ethan said, his voice rough. He turned back to Hannah, his pulse thundering. "Kid, how do you know Emily? Have you seen her?" Hannah's small fingers curled into the blanket. "They talk about her. The ones who take us." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "They say she's the favorite." Ethan felt like the air had been knocked out of him. Colton let out a long breath. This just got a hell of a lot worse. Tessa, still processing what she had heard, reached for her medical bag. "We need to figure out exactly what they did to her. I'm going to run a few tests." She pulled out a small portable scanner and gently pressed it against Hannah's arm. The machine beeped softly as it analyzed her blood. Seconds later, Tessa's face went pale. "What?" Ethan asked sharply. Tessa turned the screen toward them. "There's something in her blood. A synthetic compound. I don't recognize it, but it's not just a sedative." Colton leaned closer. "Then what is it?" Tessa's voice was grim. "It's something designed to control her." Ethan clenched his fists. "You're saying they drugged her up to keep her obedient?" "Exactly," Tessa said. "And considering how fresh it is in her system, she wasn't meant to be found alive." A heavy silence fell over the room. Colton stepped away, rubbing his temples. "We need more information. I'll start checking missing person reports, see if Hannah was ever reported." He pulled out his phone and started searching while Tessa continued examining Hannah. Ethan sat beside the couch, staring at the girl who had somehow dragged his sister's name back into his life. "Hannah," he said gently, "do you remember where you were before I found you?" Hannah's green eyes darted toward him. "A building," she whispered. "Underground. It was cold. They put us in rooms. Small rooms with no windows." Ethan swallowed hard. "How did you escape?" Hannah hesitated. "A lady let me go." Ethan's pulse quickened. "A lady?" She nodded weakly. "She said run." "So I did." Ethan exchanged a glance with Colton and Tessa. His voice was firm when he asked, "Was her name Emily?" Hannah only whispered, "I don't know." Before anyone could say more, Colton cursed under his breath. "Got something." Ethan stood and walked over. "What?" Colton turned the phone toward them. "Hannah Wells. Reported missing 6 months ago." Ethan clenched his jaw. "Someone has been looking for her." Before Colton could reply, Ethan's phone rang. A blocked number. Colton's eyes darkened. "Answer it." Ethan swiped the screen and pressed the phone to his ear. "Who is this?" A low, mechanical voice came through the line. "Walk away, trucker." Ethan stiffened. "Not happening." A long pause. Then the voice said, "Last warning." The line went dead. Ethan's grip tightened around the phone. "They're watching us." Colton immediately moved toward the window, scanning the area outside. "We need to move soon." Ethan's mind was still racing. "Whoever's behind this knows we have Hannah. And they know I won't walk away." Tessa stood, crossing her arms. "We need to figure out who benefits from this. If someone paid for her kidney, that transaction left a trail." Colton nodded. "I know where to start looking." Tessa pulled out her phone and began typing. "There's one name that keeps coming up in my research. Silas Whitmore." Ethan frowned. "Who's that?" "A billionaire," Tessa said. "Owns multiple hospitals, medical research facilities. And recently, he underwent a kidney transplant." Ethan felt his stomach turn. "You think it was hers?" Tessa nodded. "The timing fits." Colton's expression was grim. "We need more proof." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "Then let's get it." Colton began packing up his gear. "If Whitmore is tied to this, we'll need to dig carefully. Guys like him don't leave loose ends." Tessa glanced at Hannah, who had drifted into an uneasy sleep. "She's not safe anywhere public. We have to keep her off the grid." Ethan nodded. "The cabin's secure for now, but it won't stay that way." Colton's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and stiffened. Security cameras at the hospital just glitched out. Ethan frowned. "What does that mean?" Colton's voice was tight. It means someone's wiping evidence. Before anyone could respond, a soft beeping noise filled the cabin. Ethan's eyes snapped toward the window. Tessa's face went pale. Motion sensors. Ethan turned to Colton. They found us. Colton drew his gun. Then let's make them regret it. The night air was thick with tension. The motion sensor continued its faint beeping, a sound that sent a cold shiver down Ethan's spine. Colton moved first, stepping toward the window, gun raised. Lights off. Now. Ethan nodded and flicked the switch, plunging the cabin into darkness. Only the glow of the moon illuminated the space. Tessa, gripping Hannah tightly, ducked behind the couch, her breathing shallow. Outside, faint crunching footsteps echoed through the trees. They're here, Ethan whispered. Colton exhaled through his nose, steady as ever. I count at least 3 moving in. Could be more. Tessa swallowed hard. We can't fight them. Not with Hannah here. We're not fighting, Colton muttered. We're getting out. Ethan's grip tightened around the girl. Back door. Colton nodded. Yeah, but quiet. If they realize we're running, they'll move fast. They slipped toward the rear exit, Ethan carrying Hannah, her tiny body trembling against him. As they reached the door, a single gunshot rang out. Glass shattered. Move, Colton growled, shoving Ethan and Tessa out just as the front door burst open. Ethan didn't hesitate. He ran, Hannah's weight barely registering. Behind him, Colton fired a shot, taking down the first intruder. But more were coming. The woods were thick, branches clawing at Ethan's jacket as he forced his way forward. Tessa, stay close. I'm right behind you, she panted. Then, headlights flared to life in the distance. Colton cursed under his breath. They've got cars. They were ready for this. Ethan spotted Colton's truck hidden near the clearing. Get in. He threw open the door, shoving Hannah inside. Tessa climbed into the passenger seat, while Colton barely made it to the driver's side before bullets pinged off the metal. The engine roared to life, and Colton slammed the gas. The truck tore down the dirt road as black SUVs skidded onto the path behind them. Ethan gritted his teeth. They're not backing off. Colton smirked grimly. Good. That means we're pissing them off. They didn't stop until they reached a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place that didn't ask questions, which was exactly what they needed. Colton parked behind the building, out of sight from the road. Inside, Ethan laid Hannah on the bed while Tessa checked her over. She's exhausted, but stable. We need to let her rest. Colton paced, his jaw clenched. We can't keep running forever. We need names. We need someone inside the ring. Ethan ran a hand over his face. We already have one. Colton's brows furrowed. Who? Dr. Victor Sloan, Ethan said, the surgeon behind the cold room. If anyone knows where these kids go, it's him. Colton exhaled sharply. And how do you expect to get him to talk? Ethan's eyes darkened. We make him. Dr. Victor Sloan was meticulous. He ran his practice like a machine, never in the same place for too long, always covering his tracks. But no one was perfect. Through a contact, Colton tracked him to a private clinic outside the city. It was supposedly a high-end plastic surgery center, but they all knew better. We do this smart, Colton said as they sat in the truck across the street. No guns, no threats, just get him talking. Ethan cracked his knuckles. And if he doesn't talk? Colton smirked. Then we let him know what happens when he doesn't. Tessa adjusted her coat, glancing nervously toward the building. We need to be careful. If he's still operating, that means he has powerful people protecting him. Ethan opened the door. Then let's hope he's feeling chatty. They walked inside. The clinic was pristine, the kind of place designed to make people feel safe. A receptionist glanced up, her eyes wary. Dr. Sloan doesn't take walk-ins, she said. Colton flashed a fake badge. Tell him the police would like a word. Her face paled. Minutes later, Dr. Sloan entered, adjusting his glasses. He was calm. Too calm. Sheriff Hayes. I was wondering when you'd show up. Ethan stepped forward. Then you know why we're here. Sloan smiled, taking a seat. I can guess. But I'm afraid I don't know any little girls named Hannah Wells. Ethan clenched his fists. She was at your facility. And you took her kidney. Sloane leaned back, unbothered. I perform many surgeries. Colton's tone turned ice cold. This one was different. She was meant to die. And yet, here we are. Sloane's smirk faltered. Ethan seized the moment. And she knew something. A name. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Emily. Sloane stiffened. For the first time, his confidence cracked. Colton caught it too. Where is she? Sloane forced a smile. I wouldn't know. Ethan grabbed the scalpel from the nearby table and slammed it into the wooden desk inches from Sloane's hand. Try again. Sloane exhaled slowly. I don't know where she is now, but I know one thing. He met Ethan's gaze. She didn't escape. She adapted. Ethan's breath hitched. Tessa whispered, What does that mean? Sloane leaned in. She didn't run, Mr. Grayson. She became part of it. Ethan felt like the ground was crumbling beneath him. Colton's voice was sharp. Are you saying she's working with them? Sloane smiled. I'm saying she never left. They left the clinic in silence. Tessa finally broke it. He could be lying. Ethan shook his head. He was too smug. He knows something. Colton exhaled. Then we used this to flush them out. That night, Colton made a calculated leak. A report saying that Hannah Wells had been found dead. If someone was protecting the cold room, they'd react. And they did. At midnight, Ethan's phone rang. A new voice, quiet and urgent. Meet me at the old freight yard. If you want to know the truth about Emily, come alone. Ethan gritted his teeth. Who is this? A pause. Then, a whisper. Someone who knows what she's become. Ethan didn't hesitate. He drove to the abandoned freight yard, Colton and Tessa close behind. The place was deserted, save for one figure standing near a rusted-out train car. A young man, barely 20, his eyes darting nervously. You the trucker? Ethan nodded. Talk. The kid swallowed. She's alive. And she's not who you think she is. Ethan's stomach twisted. Where is she? The kid hesitated, then handed over a folder. You need to see for yourself. Ethan took it and flipped it open. His hands trembled as he saw the first photograph. A surveillance image. A woman. Long dark hair. Familiar deep-set blue eyes. Emily. Standing beside Silas Whitmore. Ethan froze. Colton muttered, Jesus Christ. Tessa covered her mouth. She's one of them. Ethan's world tilted. His sister wasn't just alive. She was working for the cold room. The motel room smelled of cheap carpet and cigarette smoke, but it was the safest place they had for now. Ethan paced near the window, his fists clenched, staring into the night. He couldn't shake the image from the surveillance photo. The woman standing next to Silas Whitmore? Emily. She was alive. Behind him, Colton scrolled through reports on his laptop, his jaw set tight. Found something. A former cold room victim. Survived, disappeared, then resurfaced last year with a new identity. If anyone knows what happened to Emily, it's him. Tessa looked up from where she sat beside Hannah. Where is he? Colton exhaled. Hiding. But I have a lead on where he might be. Ethan turned. Then let's go find him. They met their contact at an abandoned gas station off the highway. The man, Daniel Finch, was thin and wiry, his eyes darting around as he nervously wrung his hands. You shouldn't have come here, he muttered. Ethan stepped forward. We need to know about the cold room. About Emily Grayson. Daniel stiffened. I don't talk about that place. Colton took out his badge. Then you'd better start. Daniel hesitated, then sighed. Emily. She was different from the rest of us. We were experiments. She was something else. Tessa frowned. What do you mean? Daniel swallowed. She was the favorite. The ones who ran the place. They didn't just want her gone. They wanted to shape her. Ethan's stomach twisted. Where is she? Daniel shook his head. She doesn't run. She leads now. A silence fell over them. Tessa whispered. She's one of them? Daniel nodded. Not just one of them. She's in charge. Ethan felt like the ground beneath him had vanished. They drove in silence. The revelation about Emily sat like a weight on Ethan's chest. Colton finally spoke. If she's working with Whitmore, we have to assume she knows we're coming. Tessa glanced back at Hannah, who was asleep in the back seat. She saved Hannah. That has to mean something, right? Ethan gritted his teeth. Or it means she wants something. The Whitmore estate loomed ahead, a fortress of glass and steel, surrounded by high security. Colton exhaled. You sure about this? Ethan stared ahead. No, but I'm not leaving without answers. They moved in carefully, disguising themselves as delivery personnel. It worked, until it didn't. The moment they entered the building, the doors locked behind them. Damn it, Colton hissed, reaching for his gun. A voice echoed from a hidden speaker. Calm. Female. Welcome home, Ethan. His blood ran cold. Emily. The guards surrounded them within seconds, armed and deadly. Colton went for his gun, but a voice stopped him. I wouldn't. A woman stepped into the room. Ethan's breath hitched. She was older now, but those blue eyes were the same. The sister he had lost. Emily. She tilted her head, studying him. You look different, Ethan. His throat tightened. So do you. Emily's gaze flicked to Hannah, then back to him. You shouldn't have come here. Ethan took a step forward. You let her go. Why? Emily's expression remained unreadable. She wasn't supposed to make it. But I couldn't let her die. Colton cut in, his voice sharp. What the hell does that mean? Emily sighed. Hannah was a test. A failure. She wasn't meant to live. But something changed. She met Ethan's eyes. You found her. Ethan's fists clenched. This is what you do now? You let kids die? For the first time, something flickered in Emily's eyes. Pain. Regret. Then it was gone. I do what I have to, she said. Ethan shook his head. I don't believe that. Emily exhaled, then turned to the guards. Take them to the cold room. We'll see how long he holds on to his faith. The last thing Ethan saw before the world went dark was the shadow of his sister walking away. Ethan woke to metal restraints cutting into his wrists. The room was freezing, the air thick with antiseptic. Surgical lights buzzed overhead. Footsteps echoed. Emily stepped into view. You always wanted to know what happened to me, she said softly. Now you will. Ethan struggled against his restraints. You don't have to do this. Emily leaned in, her expression unreadable. That's where you're wrong. She glanced toward a second gurney. Hannah lay there, unconscious. Ethan's breath caught. Emily, please. Emily hesitated. For the first time, her mask cracked. Then, before she could speak, gunfire erupted. Colton and Tessa burst into the room. Emily's eyes flashed. You shouldn't have come here. Colton raised his weapon. Neither should you. Chaos exploded. Ethan broke free. Emily moved fast, but not fast enough. He grabbed her wrist. This isn't you. Emily met his gaze. For a moment, something human flickered in her eyes. Then, she let go. Run, she whispered. Ethan didn't hesitate. He scooped Hannah into his arms, Colton covering their escape. As they reached the door, a single gunshot rang out. Ethan turned. Emily was on the ground, bleeding. Their eyes met. For the first time in decades, she looked like his sister again. Then the guards swarmed in, and Ethan had no choice but to run. The last thing he heard was Emily's voice, soft, broken. I'm sorry. The cold steel of the cold room pressed against Ethan's back as the guards shoved him forward. His breath was ragged, his mind reeling from everything that had just unfolded. Emily was alive, and she was one of them. She stood before him, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The little sister he had lost 20 years ago was no longer the scared child in his memories. She was something else now, something colder. Ethan's wrists burned from the zip ties, but he forced himself to keep his voice steady. Emily. Her name barely left his lips before she tilted her head. Don't. His jaw clenched. You're a part of this? A flicker of something crossed her eyes. Regret, doubt. But then it was gone. I survived, she said simply. You wouldn't understand. Try me. Emily sighed, stepping forward. You still think the world is black and white. But it isn't, Ethan. It never was. Ethan shook his head. You helped Hannah escape. Why? If you're so deep in this, why let her go? For a moment, Emily hesitated. Then, her fingers traced the scar on her wrist, a scar he remembered. The last thing he saw before she disappeared. Because I remember what it was like to be her, she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's heart pounded. Then help me stop this. Her eyes hardened. It's not that simple. Colton and Tessa had been captured as well, held in a separate room. Ethan could hear their muffled voices through the walls, but he couldn't get to them. Emily sat across from him now, as if they were simply catching up over coffee instead of sitting in the heart of a nightmare. You want to know what happened to me? She finally asked. Ethan leaned forward. Yeah, I do. Emily exhaled slowly. They took me. Whitmore's people. They trained me, conditioned me, and after a while, I became valuable. Ethan's stomach twisted. Valuable for what? She looked him dead in the eye. For keeping people like Hannah alive. For deciding who lives and who doesn't. Ethan recoiled. You're telling me you choose who dies? She didn't flinch. I choose who survives. The weight of her words crushed him. You think you're saving them? He hissed. Emily's eyes darkened. Better than letting them be torn apart for their parts like cattle. Ethan felt sick. You really believe that? She leaned in. Do you really think this stops with Whitmore? The room fell silent. Whitmore is powerful, Emily continued. But he's not the one pulling the strings. There's a whole system above him. A network. You take him down, and someone else will replace him within the week. Ethan's fists clenched. Then we take them all down. Emily sighed. That's what I used to think, too. For the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of doubt in her. But before he could push further, the door slammed open. A guard stepped in. It's time. Emily rose to her feet, her mask of indifference slipping back into place. For what? Ethan demanded. The guard smirked. For the girl. Ethan's blood ran cold. Hannah. The surgical room was bright, sterile. Hannah lay strapped to a gurney, her tiny chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Then Ford dripped a sedative into her veins. Ethan fought against the guards holding him back, his voice raw. Don't do this. Emily stood at the edge of the room, her face unreadable. You don't have to do this, Ethan begged. You let her go once. You can do it again. Emily turned to Hannah. She looked so small, so much like she had once looked. Her hands clenched into fists. Then Dr. Victor Sloan entered, surgical gloves snapping into place. Let's begin, he said. Ethan thrashed against his restraints. You touch her, and I will kill you. Sloan barely spared him a glance. You're not in a position to make threats, Mr. Grayson. Ethan turned to Emily. You want to prove you're not like them? Stop this. Her fingers twitched. Then, Sloan reached for the scalpel, and Emily moved. Fast. In an instant, she had drawn a hidden blade from her sleeve, slashing across Sloan's arm. The doctor let out a strangled cry, stumbling back. The room erupted into chaos. Emily turned, keys in her hand. She moved to Ethan first, slicing the zip ties. You were right, she murmured. It was never too late. Ethan didn't waste time. As soon as his hands were free, he grabbed a guard's gun and aimed at the others. Get Hannah out of here, he ordered. Colton and Tessa burst in from the hallway, weapons drawn. Tessa ran to Hannah, checking her pulse. She's weak, but she'll make it. Colton's gun was trained on Silas Whitmore. The old man stood at the far end of the room, arms crossed. You think this changes anything? He sneered. You can't stop what's already in motion. Ethan's grip tightened on his gun. Watch me. But before he could pull the trigger, Emily shoved him aside. A gunshot rang out, and she fell. Ethan caught her before she hit the ground. Blood soaked her shirt, spreading fast. Emily, he gasped. She smiled weakly. Guess. This is what redemption looks like. Ethan shook his head. No, we can fix this. Her fingers curled around his wrist. Keep her safe, she whispered, her eyes flickering to Hannah. Then, she stopped breathing. The alarms blared as the facility descended into chaos. Colton grabbed Ethan's shoulder. We have to go. Ethan couldn't move. He stared down at his sister's body, his heart breaking. Tessa's voice was urgent. Ethan. He forced himself to stand. They ran. Whitmore's men tried to stop them, but Colton and Tessa took them down. Ethan carried Hannah, shielding her from the gunfire as they burst into the open air. They reached the getaway car just as the facility exploded behind them. As they sped away, Ethan stared into the rearview mirror, watching the flames consume everything. Colton exhaled. "It's over." Ethan didn't respond, because he knew the truth. This was only the beginning. The sky burned red with the reflection of fire. Ethan stood outside the facility, his breath ragged. The explosion had collapsed most of the cold room, sending flames licking into the night sky. Screams and sirens mixed in the air, but Ethan could only hear the sound of his own heartbeat. In his arms, Hannah stirred weakly, her body limp from the sedatives still running through her system. Tessa pressed a hand to his shoulder. "We have to go." Behind them, Colton was securing Dr. Victor Sloan in handcuffs. The lead surgeon of the cold room looked dazed, his face streaked with soot. Sheriff Lawson's team had arrived just in time, swarming the area, but the true masterminds had already disappeared into the shadows. Silas Whitmore was gone. Emily was dead. Ethan turned toward the facility one last time. His sister had given him the chance to escape. But was it redemption, or just another form of punishment? The answer didn't matter now, because the fight wasn't over. 2 hours later, Ethan sat in the back of an ambulance. Hannah was asleep, curled against his side, an oxygen mask on her face. Tessa checked her vitals again, her fingers steady despite everything that had just happened. "She's stable. She needs rest, but she'll recover." Ethan let out a slow breath, his shoulders dropping for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Colton approached, shaking his head. "Sloan's not talking. Claims he was just a doctor following orders. Says he doesn't know who's at the top." Ethan clenched his jaw. "Liar." Colton sighed. "Yeah, but it might not matter. The FBI is taking over now. They'll dig into his accounts, his past, and maybe, just maybe, they'll find something useful." Ethan didn't believe in maybe. "They'll bury this," he muttered, "just like they always do." Colton's face hardened. "Not if we don't let them." Ethan glanced at Hannah, brushing a stray piece of hair from her face. "I don't care about the investigation. I just care about keeping her safe." Colton nodded. "That's where we've got a problem." Ethan's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" Tessa exhaled. "She doesn't have anywhere to go, Ethan." Ethan's head snapped up. "What about witness protection?" Colton hesitated. "She could disappear into a new identity, but let's be real, that's a temporary solution. If these people want her, they'll find her." Ethan's pulse hammered. "So what are you saying?" Tessa and Colton exchanged a glance. Tessa's voice was gentle, careful. "She needs someone who won't let that happen." Ethan's chest tightened. "You're saying she needs me?" Hannah stirred, her fingers tightening in his shirt. "She already chose you," Tessa whispered. The motel room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the heater. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, staring at a single photograph, the one Colton had given him before they left the cold room. It was an old surveillance image. Emily, standing beside Silas Whitmore. The last piece of proof that she had once been on the other side. Ethan closed his eyes. He had spent 20 years mourning her. He had imagined her dead, cold, buried beneath forgotten dirt. But instead, she had been here, alive, twisted into something unrecognizable. She had betrayed him, but she had saved him too. And that was the worst part. A knock on the door broke his thoughts. Colton stood outside, holding 2 beers. He handed one to Ethan before leaning against the wall. "You all right?" Ethan scoffed. "What do you think?" Colton exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. "I think you went through hell tonight, and you still have a long way to go." Ethan took a sip of his beer, barely tasting it. "You think this is really over?" Colton shook his head. "Not even close." Ethan met his gaze. "How many more of these places are there?" Colton's jaw tensed. "Too many." Silence stretched between them. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Guess that means I've got work to do." The sun was rising when Ethan walked outside to find Hannah sitting on the motel steps, watching the pink and orange sky. She turned at the sound of his footsteps. "You okay, kid?" Hannah hesitated, then shrugged. "I don't know." Ethan sat beside her. "Yeah, me neither." She pulled her knees up to her chest, staring at the horizon. "Where do we go now?" Ethan looked down at her. "Not where do I go. Where do we go? His throat tightened. He had spent his whole life running. From his past. From the guilt. From the people he had lost. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running. He ruffled Hannah's hair, making her scowl. Guess we'll figure it out together, huh? For the first time, a small, hesitant smile crossed her lips. Yeah, she whispered. Ethan was packing the truck when his phone rang. A blocked number. His stomach twisted. He debated ignoring it, but instinct told him not to. He answered. A voice crackled through the line. Low, calm, familiar. You really think this is over? Ethan's blood ran cold. His grip tightened around the phone. Who is this? A chuckle. We'll be seeing you soon, trucker. The line went dead. Ethan lowered the phone slowly. He turned toward the truck, where Hannah was waiting. His pulse steadied. No, this wasn't over. But this time, he was ready. What if the truth you were searching for turned out to be more terrifying than the lies? Ethan Grayson's journey began with a simple act of kindness, saving a child on the side of the road. But what he uncovered was a web of corruption, so deep that even the people he trusted were not who they seemed. The cold room was only one facility, one piece of a monstrous puzzle that stretches further than anyone could imagine. If places like this exist in fiction, how close do you think we are to similar horrors in reality? Tell us in the comments. What do you think happens next? Who do you believe is really pulling the strings? If you enjoyed this video and want to dive into more gripping stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. There's so much more to uncover, and together, we'll keep exposing the truth, one story at a time. Join us on this journey.